Chapter 35. It's a little early to be showing you this, Will said, as he led the curious party uphill towards a secluded corner of the valley. So far, we only have equipment for 10 men. The others have to take it in turn to train and practice. Practice what? Evelyn asked, but Holt signalled her to wait. They stopped at a point where a grove of trees screened a smaller gully. Will and Celathan ushered them forward, and they came to a flat section of land, 40 metres by 20. Horace pointed to a line of fascines, bundles of light branches tied together, each about the size of a man, standing at the far end of the gully. What are they? Will grinned at him. They're the enemy. He looked at Celathan. Do you want to take over? The Aridi warrior shrugged deferentially. It was your idea. I'm just an assistant. Will nodded, gathered his thoughts for a second, then proceeded. I got the inklings of this idea when we first arrived here and I saw the Kikori at work. Their group discipline was excellent. Shigeru nodded. It has to be. Timber cutting is a dangerous business. Exactly, Will said. Then Horace, I think, said that the Senshi, with their years of training, excelled at individual combat. How, one-on-one, they were generally superior to our Araluen warriors. He glanced a question at Horace, who also nodded. Holt settled back, leaning comfortably against a rock, smiling at his former pupil. He thought he could see where this was heading, but he wasn't sure how Will planned to achieve it. Now, all of this rang a bell in my memory. I'd heard this sort of thing before. It drove me mad for a few days. Then I remembered where it had been. He paused, and Holt's smile widened as the others unconsciously leaned forward, waiting for him to continue. His young pupil couldn't resist the opportunity for a little drama. I recalled General Sapristi saying much the same things. General who? Horace asked, totally puzzled. He was a general in Toscana who arranged a demonstration of their fighting methods for us, Will explained. The Toscan legions have developed a system of fighting as a team. It's simple, so there's no need for them to learn or practice complex swordplay. They just have to jab and stab and shove. The secret is, they all work together. He paused. His throat was a little dry with all this talking, and he gestured for Celathan to take up the story. As the general told us, individually, his legionnaires would be no match for expert warriors. Their strength lies in their teamwork and their equipment. Celathan paused, then turned and called out an order. Kikori, show yourselves! He and Will had sent a messenger ahead to let the trainees know they were coming. Now, on his command, a file of 10 Kikori trotted out from behind a pile of boulders halfway up the valley. But they were equipped as no Kikori had ever been equipped before. Shigeru stared at them, fascinated. Each man carried a long rectangular shield. It was slightly curved and made of wood, reinforced at the top and sides with strips of iron. In the centre, a plate-sized iron boss protruded. The men also wore hard leather breastplates and leather helmets. These too were trimmed with iron strips for extra protection. As they ran, moving at a steady jog, they held long wooden javelins sloped over their shoulders. Horace moved forward to look more closely. They're pretty primitive, he said. The javelins were roughly trimmed wooden stocks, about 1.5 meters long, each with an iron rod bound to it, protruding some 50 centimetres past the wooden stock. The iron rod ended in a barbed point. They don't need to be anything more than that, Will told him. Celathan, will you conduct the drill, please? He turned to the others. Let's move down a little, to the side. You'll be able to see better." He led the way to a small rock outcrop halfway down the gully. Selathan kept the 10 Kikori in a line, waiting expectantly. When his companions were settled, Will called to Selathan. "Enemy sighted!" "Battle formation!" Selathan barked the command. Instantly, every second man in the line took 2 paces backwards. Then both lines closed up, so that where there had been 10 men in one line, there were now 2 ranks of 5. The movement was accomplished in seconds. "Forward!" Selathan commanded. The 2 ranks stepped off together, pacing steadily forward, with the Kikori on the right end of the second rank calling time. "Impressive," said Horace softly. Will glanced quickly at him. "As I said, their sense of discipline is excellent. They pick up these drills quickly." Then he looked away and shouted to Selathan again. "Enemy archers!" "Halt!" cried Selathan. The steadily advancing Kikori crashed to a stop. Holt remembered Will's phrase at the display in Toscana. "A cloud of dust and a line of statues." General Sapristi would have been impressed, he thought. "Come!" Selathan ordered. The Emperor leaned back and looked at Will, a little confused. "Tortoise?" But Will gestured towards the 10 trainees. The front rank had raised their shields to head height, while the second rank held theirs higher, parallel to the ground, the edges overlapping the tops of the front rank's shields. The 10 men were now protected from the front and above by an uninterrupted carapace. "Ah, yes, tortoise, I see," Shigeru said thoughtfully. "Kame, down!" Selathan ordered, and the shields came back to their original position. "Front rank, Yari!" Now the front rank took a large pace forward. The men turned side on, reversed their grips on the rough javelins, and, as one, leaned their weight onto their right feet, the long weapons going back over their shoulders, pointing up at a 30-degree angle. "Throw!" They released as one, each man putting the strength and power of his entire body behind the cast. The weapons sailed high, then arced down as the weight of the iron tips took effect. 3 of the fascines were struck and knocked to the ground, while the other 2 javelins bounded and slithered harmlessly past them. Already, Selathan was ordering the second rank forward. They moved through the first rank and repeated the sequence of movements. Another 5 javelins soared across the short distance. Another fascine was hit. "Imagine that, but with 50 javelins each time instead of 1, Will said. Horace nodded thoughtfully. A barrage of 50 of those rough-looking weapons could be devastating to an opposing force. His military mind had seen the value of the soft iron tips, understanding how a warrior, even lightly wounded, would be impeded by the dragging weight of the javelin. "But now they are unarmed," Shigeru said. He had been looking carefully, but could see no sign of the long katana that were the principal weapon of the senshi. No sooner had he said the words than he heard the scraping rattle of blades being drawn. He saw now that each of the Kikori was armed with a short weapon. "Isho ni," Selathan called. The 2 ranks began to advance, shields locked together. "Isho ni!" The shout was echoed from 10 throats, then repeated as they moved steadily forward. Will looked at the Emperor. "We're using Nihon-Ja for the more important commands," he explained. "Less chance of misunderstanding that way." "Appropriate," Shigeru answered. Evelyn cocked her head to one side curiously. "What does Isho ni mean?" "Together," Alice told her. "It's their battle cry," Will said. "It reminds them of how they fight, as a team." He cupped his hands and called to Selathan. "Bring them towards us!" The Iridi waved acknowledgement and called an order. The left-hand marker on each rank began to march in place, while his comrades wheeled to the left in a steady, coordinated movement. Horace whistled softly. They might have been born to do this. Now the two ranks were facing the spectators, and Selethan called another sequence of orders. The wheeling movement stopped, and the formation, still intact, began to advance again. Shigeru and the others could see the value of the large shields. The men themselves were virtually invisible, only the tops of their helmets showing above the wall of shields. There was nothing for a swordsman to engage, the Emperor realized. But darting out from narrow gaps between the shields, he could see the short weapons the Kikori carried, flickering like so many snakes' tongues. "How can they see?" he asked. Will smiled. "Not very well. Their commander controls the direction of the advance. But they stab at anything that comes into sight through the gaps in the shields. Arms, legs, bodies. It's just stab and move forward, stab and move forward. We don't teach them any of the sort of sweeping, scything strokes that the senshi use. They don't need to learn any complex techniques. Just stab quickly and withdraw the weapon immediately. If a senshi warrior attacks one of them, he's confronted by a huge shield. And if he presses the attack, the man next to his opponent will probably stab him as he does so." "Where do their swords come from?" Holt asked. "Some of them are the short swords carried by the senshi killed at Riverside Village or at the Palisade. The rest are cut down spears, with the shafts reinforced with iron strips." "But a good katana will shear easily through iron like that," Shigeru protested. Will conceded the point. "Admittedly, that's why each man will carry 2 reserve swords. But they're not using their short swords to parry or block the senshi's katana. That's what the shields are for. And if a katana cuts into the iron and wood of a shield, its owner could find himself in trouble." "I don't understand," the Emperor frowned. But Horace had seen the truth of what Will said. In fact, he'd used the same idea as a tactic in times past. "If the katana cuts into the shield, it will be jammed for a few seconds while its owner gets it free. And in that time, he'll have 2 or 3 Kikori stabbing at him. He stands to lose either his sword or his life." "Yes." The Emperor fingered his chin thoughtfully. He had to admit that this display was a little unnerving. He was raised in the senshi tradition, and egalitarian as he might be, it was unsettling to see that 2 foreigners had so quickly devised a way to counteract senshi techniques. Will held up his hand now, and Selethan called the troop to a halt. Another command, and as one, they grounded their shields and bowed to their emperor. Shigeru rose from where he had been seated on the rock and bowed deeply in return. His qualms of a few minutes ago were gone. These were his people, just as much as the senshi were, he realized. They were willing to fight for him and to learn new ways of doing so. They deserved his respect and loyalty. Will slid down from the rock and walked among the Kikori troops, slapping them on the shoulder and offering words of congratulation to them as he went. Then he and Selethan dismissed them and rejoined the others. "We've got 3 months," he said to Holt. "We plan to train and equip 200 men in these techniques." Holt nodded. "With 2 centuries of trained men, you could give Arasaka a very nasty surprise indeed. Well done, Will. And you too, Selethan." The Aridi bowed and made his traditional greeting gesture. "As I said, it was Will's idea," he replied. "But like you, I think it will be very effective." Horace drooped an arm over Will's shoulder and shook his head. His slightly built friend never ceased to amaze him. "You seem to have a habit of creating armies out of nowhere," he said. "Pity there aren't 100 Araluen slaves here you could train as archers." He was referring to the potent force of archers Will had formed to fight the Temujai army. "One thing," he added, with a slight frown, "you're going to need a lot of iron for helmets and shields and stabbing swords. Where are you going to find it?" "We have it already," Will grinned. "The Kikori metalworkers are busy melting down the cache of old weapons you discovered. We don't need finely tempered steel, and they should do the job nicely." "I wonder," said Horace, "if I'll ever ask you a question you can't answer." Will considered the idea for a second or two, then shook his head. "I shouldn't think so.